Well, we've been working our way through the Gospel of Mark. We've been going section after section after section, and we're coming to the end of the Gospel. We've just had part of it read, and it's all about Jesus being condemned to death. And next weekend, we'll be seeing that Jesus is indeed crucified on the cross. But because we've been reading through Mark section after section, this doesn't come as a surprise to us. It doesn't come as a surprise because Jesus himself has been prophesying that this is what's going to happen to him. And I want to show you one of those. Come back to Mark chapter 10 to start with. Mark chapter 10, verse 32. Listen to Jesus speak about what's going to happen to him. From verse 32, and they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed him were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise." And this is Jesus prophesying before the fact what's going to happen to him. And it's not just, I'm going to die or I'm going to go to the cross. Notice the details. I'm going to be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes. They're the ones who are going to condemn me. Then they're going to hand me over to the Gentiles, and they're going to mock me before they crucify me. Very detailed. And the passage we're looking at today, we see all of those things take place, just as Jesus has said. And the reason Jesus can know about it, and the reason it happens just as Jesus said, is because this was God's plan for Jesus, that Jesus would go to the cross. And my prayer is that by the end of today, I hope each one of us will understand, why did God plan it this way? Why would God plan for his son to go to the cross? Well, let's start. Mark 14, picking up from verse 53, and we're going to see Jesus delivered over to the chief priests and scribes. And they led Jesus to the high priests, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. And Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. He was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy the temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.' Yet, even about this, their testimony did not agree." Here we see Jesus, he's before the Jewish court. But perhaps we should call it a kangaroo court. I wonder if you've ever heard that term, a kangaroo court. I wonder if you understand what it means. A kangaroo court is when a court ignores facts, a court ignores laws, because the people in judgment have already decided what's going to happen, and they've already decided the person's guilty. Have a look at verse 55 again with me. We're told, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. That is, they've already determined Jesus deserves to go to death even before they've got the evidence, and so now they're fishing for the evidence. They want to find evidence to be able to back up what they're thinking, but straight up the back we're told they find none. In fact, what follows actually shows Jesus' innocence. In verse 56, we're told that many bear false witness. They make up false claims that Jesus is guilty. And in verse 57 and following, we get told what one of those lies are about. Have a look at verse 57. It said, "Some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.' Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree." Now, at first glance, you might be thinking, how is this false? That was my first thought this week as I was looking at it, because Jesus does talk about the destruction of the temple. But when you look at the detail, you see that they twist Jesus' words. They make out that Jesus made a personal threat that he himself would go and destroy the temple. Like he would get a sledgehammer and go and knock down the wall like we did with the wall that was here before. That he would do that to the temple. But that's not what Jesus said. And it's not what he meant. Let's see what Jesus meant, what Jesus said. Mark chapter 13. Here's where we get told that Jesus spoke about it. Mark 13 from verse 1. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. Look how magnificent this temple is, Jesus." Verse 2, and Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Notice Jesus doesn't say, "I'm going to come with a sledgehammer, I'm going to knock it all down." He speaks matter-of-factly. One day, all these stones are going to be knocked down. There won't be one stone upon another. And as we went through Mark 13 a few weeks ago, we saw that Jesus was pointing out something that actually did happen about 40 years later. That the temple was destroyed as the Romans came in and destroyed it, all as a judgment from God. But Jesus' threat wasn't, "I will destroy the temple." And they seem to know that as well, because we're told that they don't all agree with each other. You see, they have to make up lies about Jesus. That's all these testimonies, they're making up lies because Jesus is innocent. Pilate himself picks up on this. And jump ahead, we're going to look at this a bit later. Jump ahead to chapter 15, verse 12. Pilate's got the case before him, and this is what Pilate says. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." We're going to unpack this in more detail in a little while. But notice for now that as Pilate looks at the case that's before him about Jesus, he sees that Jesus isn't guilty. He says, "Why? What evil has he done?" There's no evil. He's innocent. And this is important for us to see, because Jesus is going to be killed. He will be crucified on the cross, but not because he's guilty. He is, in fact, innocent. So why is he condemned? Well, let's get back into Mark 14. Pick it up from where we left off, verse 60. And the high priest stood up in the midst, and they asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? Why is it that these men testify against you?" But he remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his clothes and said, "What further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. The high priest, he picks up, takes charge now. He speaks straight to Jesus, and notice verse 61, he asks Jesus a question. He says, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Son of the Blessed?" Now, Christ is a translation of the Old Testament word Messiah, and it means an anointed king. And the Old Testament said that this Christ, this Messiah, would one day come and that he would be the king and that he would bless not only the Jews but all people. And the Old Testament would often speak that the Christ or the Messiah would have this special relationship with God, that he would be like the Son of God. And so when the high priest asked Jesus, "Are you the Christ?" This is a very loaded question. And Jesus declares, verse 62, "I am. I am the Christ. I am the one that God is anointing to be king. I am the one that's going to bring in the blessing for all people." And then he goes on to say more. Verse 62 says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Not only does Jesus say, I'm the Christ, he says, I'm the Son of Man as well. And to understand what Jesus is talking about, let's go in the Old Testament. Let's go to Daniel chapter 7 and see what Jesus is talking about. Flick back to Daniel chapter 7. It is going to be on the screen as well. We're going to pick it up from verse 13. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Notice there in verse 13, Daniel says the Son of Man is going to come to the Ancient of Days. That is, he's going to come to God the Father. And he says how? He says that the Son of Man is going to come on the clouds of heaven. That's the same language that Jesus uses in Mark, isn't it? And notice why the Son of Man comes to the Ancient of Days. He comes to be given a dominion. He comes to be given a kingdom. He comes to be given a kingship. And we're told how big this is. This kingship is one that's going to last for all time, and it's going to last over all people. And so we're told how the people should respond. We're told that all peoples, nations, languages should serve him. That's the rightful response to the Son of Man. And so then we come back into Mark. And Jesus is saying that he is the Son of Man who's about to go to the Ancient of Days. He's saying he's going to be appointed king over all peoples, which is a massive claim, isn't it? Absolutely huge. And the high priest gets this. He gets just how big it is. We're told he rips his clothes and he cries out, blasphemy! How dare you say that? Jesus, your claim to be the Christ, to have this special relationship with God, that's a lie. And you're mocking God. And so they condemn him to death, which is the correct judgment if Jesus is guilty. But he's not lying. He really is the Christ. He really is the King. He really is the Son of Man. And so what should they be doing? Serving him. But what they do is condemn him to death instead. What a great atrocity. But remember, while they're guilty of this atrocity, it's all a plan of God. This is all happening just as Jesus said, right? He said, I'm going to be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes. They're going to condemn me to death, and then they're going to hand me over to the Gentiles, which is exactly what happens in chapter 15, verse 1. But before we go there, Mark doesn't go there. Mark goes somewhere else. Mark has just shown us in the Jewish courtroom, and now he's going to show us in the courtyard as well. We've just seen Jesus, and now he's going to focus on Peter, and he does so in a way that helps us, contrast the two of them. Jesus we've just seen before the bigwigs. Jesus just before the chief priests and the scribes, and Jesus remained faithful to who he was. Peter is among the servants. Peter's among bystanders, and he's unfaithful to Jesus under pressure. We read this before. You might remember 3 times Peter denies Jesus. Have a look at the third one of those with me. Verse 71. But he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know this man of whom you speak. He decided to speak and say, I've got a curse. I think he's saying, God curse me if I'm not speaking the truth. I don't know Jesus. Now that's striking, isn't it? Calling out God's curse on yourself if you're lying And he's definitely lying. So he does deserve God's curse on him. And the rooster crows. And it hits Peter what he's done. He's just been unfaithful to the Christ. He's just been unfaithful to the King. And Peter realises just how serious his unfaithfulness is, and we're told he breaks down and he weeps. I reckon we can be really tempted to look at Peter and just shake our heads. How could he do that? And I think rightly so, because being unfaithful to Jesus is that serious. But if we're prepared to shake our head at Peter, let's be prepared to shake our head at ourselves as well for the times that we're unfaithful to the Christ. Let's be ready to weep at our own failures before Jesus. Let's realise that we deserve a curse from God for being unfaithful to the King. And so I want to move on now. I want to go to the next section, because in the next section we see hope. Hope for Peter and hope for us all. Pick it up from Mark chapter 15. We're going to actually read from verse 1 right through to verse 20. Follow along with me. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation from the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they just shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters. They called together the whole battalion, and they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. They began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak, put on his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. Striking passage, isn't it? A moving passage. Again, we see things happen just like Jesus said they would. He's now delivered over to the Gentiles, who now mock him and spit on him. And they're about to crucify him. I want to look at this section by looking at three people fairly quickly. We're going to look at Pilate, we're going to look at the mob, and then we're going to look at Barabbas. So Pilate, he's the Gentile leader. He's the Roman authority over Judea, and he's amazed by Jesus, we're told. Have a look at verse 5. It says that, but Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Pilate's amazed because Jesus remains quiet as he's facing these accusations. Jesus doesn't seek to get out of the charges. Jesus doesn't point out all the lies that they're saying. And so he remains silent. And Peter's also switched on to work out the real reason that Jesus is before him. Verse 10, we're told, for he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. The chief priests are filled with envy. People are listening to Jesus. Jesus has authority that they want. And Pilate sees through them. See, Pilate is switched on. And we saw earlier that Pilate saw Jesus' innocence. Verse 14, Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? There's no guilt here. Jesus is innocent. So we know that Pilate knows that Jesus isn't guilty. We know that Pilate knows that envy is behind all of this, and yet he still hands Jesus over to be killed. Why? Well, because he's a people pleaser. Have a look at verse 15. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Pilate's got Jesus before him, and all these people want Jesus killed, and so he hands him over. Seeks to please the people. How foolish does that make him? He condemns the King of the world to die on the cross. But a mob can be powerful, can't it? I will see that today when a mob of people get together and get loud enough, foolish things happen. That's not new. The foolish thing happened because a mob got loud enough. When Pilate suggests to release Jesus, they just get louder. Crucify him, crucify him. They want blood. And blood is what they get. Blood on Jesus' back, verse 15, as Jesus is scourged. That means they use a whip that has bone and metal embedded in it, so when they hit Jesus on the back, it tears Jesus' body apart. Blood on Jesus' head, verse 17, as they make a crown of thorns and they push it down on his head. We're told that they spit on him and they mock him. And notice what the mocking's all about. They put a purple robe on him. That's kingly colour. They put a crown on him. That's kingly adornment. They kneel down before him as if he is a king. They salute him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," just like when Caesar comes into town, they would say, "Hail, Caesar." The whole mocking is in terms of Jesus being the king, and they think there's no way Jesus is king. But the irony is he is king. And so how foolish the mob have been to play a crucial part in having the king murdered. And today mobs still get together and the mobs can still be loud, and generally the mobs are still saying Jesus isn't king. Don't be foolish and listen to them. Don't care more about what the mob, what other people outside say. Jesus is king. Live for him. Which brings us to Barabbas. Verse 7, we're told he's a murderer in the insurrection. There's no question about his guilt. He's guilty of both of these things. He deserves to be punished. And yet, as we read through the events, we're told in verse 15 that the guilty Barabbas walks free, while the innocent Jesus is delivered to death. Or what we can say is Jesus faces the punishment that Barabbas rightly deserved, while Barabbas walks free like Jesus rightly deserved. It's what we call a substitution, a swapping of places. And here's the question I want to ask. Was that substitution by chance? Was it just a good day for Pilate? Not Pilate, Barabbas. Or was it planned too? And if it was it planned just for Barabbas, or was it planned for more people as well? Come with me to the Old Testament, to Isaiah 53. It's a great Old Testament passage that speaks about the death of the servant of God. Pick it up from verse 10. Isaiah 53 from verse 10. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for his guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. Do you see there right at the end of verse 20? He bore the sin of many. Because Jesus was the innocent one, and only because he was the innocent one, he could be the substitute for guilty people before God. Jesus could step in and take the place of the guilty so that the guilty could go free. And not just for one, but for many, we're told. So Jesus could say to the Father, Father, punish me so that these ones can go free. And that's just what he did. In fact, this is why God planned it for Jesus to go to the cross. God knew that the only way for guilty people to be set free was for an innocent one to be substituted in their place. And God the Father said to the Son, let that one be you. And so Jesus came and he didn't fight the charges. He spoke the truth of who he was, knowing that it was going to lead him to being condemned, so that he could substitute in for the guilty. Guilty people like Barabbas. Guilty people like Peter. Guilty people like you and me. And so let me ask you, have you asked Jesus to take your place? To substitute in for you before God? Have you asked Jesus to forgive you so you can be set free? If you haven't yet, can I urge you, do so today. And for those of you who have turned to Jesus, give thanks to God that Jesus is the one who has set you free. And then remember who Jesus is now. Because he is the Son of Man who went on the clouds to his Father. He is the one who the Father gave all kingdoms, that he would be king over all people. Jesus is the forever King. And so as freed people, let's serve the King. Let's pray. Father, by ourselves we admit we are guilty people, deserving of your curse and judgment. But thank you for your plan to substitute Jesus so that we, the guilty, can go free. And thank you for showing us who Jesus really is, the rightful King. May we use our freedom to forever serve him. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.